Welcome. I'm Leslie Warner, and I work in Alumni Career Services. Susanna Kren, who's working with me, is going to be letting you in from the waiting room while we're taking a minute to do that and get started. If you wish to, we'd love to have you just go into the chat and put in one word saying where you are geographically, or maybe two, where are you calling in from, and one word to describe kind of what you're feeling as it relates to the topic of this webinar. If you want to, we invite you to do that. So is everyone welcomed in, or are people still coming? Susanna? Some still coming. Okay. Let's see what we might have in the chat. Wait a minute, it's the wrong thing showing on my screen. There we go. Yeah, so we have a few people from who are curious or wanting to grow, or California or North Carolina. Oh, Buenos Aires. Oh, good. I want to go there. So again, I'm Leslie Warner. I want to welcome you to this session, Leading with Influence, featuring Arielle Sadan, a Tufts alum and executive coach, and owner of Revel&Awe, her own company. We have two main goals in Tufts alumni career programs. One is to present programs like this, including webinars and sometimes in-person networking events. And these events are for all alumni, all schools, and we're starting to get back to in-person events in some cities. So please check the Alumni and Friends calendar, which Susanna will be putting into the chat, but it's also easy to find online. And Arielle will be joining us at the June reunion, facilitating a session. So if it's your reunion year, you'll get to meet her in person and tap into a little more of her brain and thoughts. Tune in for details on our April and May webinars coming up. We're going to start to promote them soon, within a week or so. Topics are job search success secrets. I guess I won't blow it too much to say the big secret is networking. So it's really not a secret, but I will be telling you a little more about that. And then ACE, that's on April 13th, and then ACE that interview on May 25th. The secret there is preparation and practice. So there you go. You've got the two webinars. Our second goal is to foster connections between alumni and between alumni and students, including through the HERD. And the HERD is a resource for alumni to alumni networking and mentoring and networking from alumni to students. Currently, we have a little over 3,000 alumni users, but it's growing. And we've just put a link to that in the chat box as well. Now, for today's webinar, we, as in primarily Arielle, will be presenting for about 50 minutes today. And we'll try our best to address your questions during this session. You can type your questions into the chat box, and Arielle, Susanna, and I will be monitoring that and addressing them along the way. If for whatever reason we don't get to your question, you're welcome to stay on the call, and we can stay on about 15 minutes after 2 p.m. Eastern time. And Arielle will also drop her email into the chat box so you can reach out to her after today. We're going to be recording this webinar, and it will be posted onto our YouTube playlist. And you can also see on the YouTube playlist past programs, sometimes on topics like this about leadership or personal career management, and the nuts and bolts ones on resume, interviewing, job search, and so on. Now, finally, before I introduce our speaker, I just want to acknowledge the Office of Alumni Engagement's Community Values Statement, which Susanna is posting into the chat box now. Let me introduce our speaker today. As I mentioned, Arielle Sadan is a Tufts alum, executive coach, and her company is called Revel&Awe. I first met her a few years ago in a New York networking event when she was, I think, maybe in her first job after Tufts. So you never know what direction things will take you or how your paths may cross again. Fortunately, I think we behaved pretty well and had a bit of a nice chat at that event. So it all comes around, and she reached out to us after she was building her coaching practice and had some of that expertise to share and offered to help out. And that's where these programs have come from. Arielle loves identifying what makes people tick and figuring out how to help them tick better. In other words, she loves to help her clients learn how to become the best versions of themselves. As a certified professional coach, she specializes in helping mid-career professionals and leaders and high potential folks develop their leadership skills, carve out fulfilling career paths, and live into their potential. She received her professional coaching certification from Institute for Professional Excellence in Coaching and is credentialed by the International Coach Federation. Now, I turn it over to Arielle.
Thank you so much, Leslie. It's so nice to be back here. I see some familiar faces, or at least names. But actually, that reminds me that if you want, if you feel comfortable, I invite you to turn on your cameras and join in the conversation. I love seeing your faces. It helps me get a sense of whether or not what I'm sharing is landing. If you're interested, if you have a question and you want to be prompted to share it in the group. I love seeing the faces as we go through. So feel free to turn on your camera if you feel comfortable. I also recognize that some of you might be eating lunch or dinner or breakfast. I'm okay personally if you want to eat on camera, but others might not. So feel free to do what you feel comfortable with. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Today we're talking about leading through influence. And there are a few things that come up when we talk about leadership and influence that we're going to get into, but I really love this topic for so many reasons, not least of which is that so often we feel like we don't have the authority or the title to allow us to direct people and do what we want them to do. And so we have to be a little bit more strategic in how we show up and communicate with them so that we can get them to do what we want them to do in a thoughtful and I'll say generous way. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I will also note that I'm going to try and keep a close eye on the chat for any questions that come up. But Leslie and Susanna are going to help me out in the background in case I miss something, and we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. Yes, without coercion. That was a question that came in, leading without coercion. So a little bit about me, just to add to the information that Leslie shared. As she mentioned, I'm an executive coach. My coaching company is called Revel&Awe. My background is pretty varied, but most of it was in management consulting, where I worked on large-scale change management and transformation programs with stakeholders throughout the corporate ladder, from the C-suite at the top all the way down to boots on the ground. And today, as a coach, I support individuals and their organizations to really realize their potential. I do this by aligning individual strengths with the organizational needs, focusing on improving communication and leadership skills, and really building confidence, ownership, and growth orientation in the individual, in teams, and in the organization at large. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to let me know afterwards. So goals for today. First of all, we're going to understand influence and find some opportunities to exert it. We're going to explore some key elements of selling our own ideas. And then we're going to think about also best practices to help mold other people's ideas. And I'll go into this a little bit more so you'll get a sense for what that means when I talk about it. So let's dive in. In the chat, if you feel comfortable, please share what have been some of the biggest challenges that have come up for you in influencing others. Now, I see we have a lot of people joining us, so I'm expecting a wide variety of experiences. I'm going to call a few out as we go along. Establishing credibility, yes. Being overexcited and maybe showing up with a little bit of impatience, totally get that. The belief that I know that what I'm talking about, maybe they don't know that I know what I'm talking about. Feeling like I don't have authority, the firm hold and status quo, power imbalances, these are great. As a woman, not seeming too aggressive, I'm going to talk specifically about that. Pushing back and saying no, getting attention, challenging groupthink, these are all amazing. And if you're scrolling through the chat, you might see other people are sharing similar experiences as you have. These are all super valid. So let's talk about leadership. I love this definition by Kevin Kruse. He wrote this great article in, I want to say, Forbes, where he defines leadership as a process of social influence, which maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of a goal. Seems pretty straightforward. I love this definition specifically because he talks about leadership, first of all, as a process. It is not necessarily a specific quality that you have or don't have. It is not a direct skill that you have to master, although one might argue that it is, but rather a process, meaning it's not on or off, but created over time. And the second piece that I love is about this idea of social influence. And that really helps me when I think about it, define how we can find the ways in which we can influence others, meaning it's not just a do this because I tell you to, right, which is that kind of coercive leadership model, but rather the way that we can use the way that we show up in order to create results. And that means that you don't have to be a title leader in an organization in order to help influence others, because you can help maximize the efforts that they bring towards the achievement of a goal, even if you are just an intern, right? Anybody can really step up into this version of leadership. Which brings us to defining what influence is. And at the basic level, it means that influence is the ability to have an impact on the behaviors, attitudes, and opinions and choices of others. Also relatively straightforward, but that creation of the impact is the thing that a lot of us struggle with. Sometimes because we don't feel strong enough or that we are enough to create that kind of impact. Maybe we don't feel that we have the right title. Maybe we feel that the culture of our organization or our team restricts the impact that we can create. But hopefully what we'll explore a little bit together today is the way that we can create that impact at any level of the organization, at any point in our careers. And for what it's worth, this also applies not only to the workplace, but also outside. So if you end up practicing this outside of work with your friends or your family, let me know what the results are. Now, before I go into the next two slides, I want to call out that leadership and influence is something that everybody can work on. This is things that you can improve. You are not born with a particular skill or lacking that particular skill that are either on or off. That said, for some groups, exerting leadership and influence and showing up as leaders and being influential are more challenging. The next slide and part of the slide after that are specifically about how this impacts women. So yes, some of these things are universal, but I want to call this out because it's important to recognize the ways that certain identities might impact the way that others perceive us. So let's talk about women and the leadership track really quickly. There are a lot of studies about women in leadership. One shows that women are 14% less likely to be promoted each year. They are judged as having lower leadership potential than men, even though more often than not, they have higher performance ratings. They're less likely to be offered advice from senior leaders. And what we often find is that women are over-mentored, meaning they get a lot of advice, but under-sponsored, meaning that people aren't advocating for them when they're not in the room. And this is relative to their male peers, which really impacts their ability to advance in organizations, right? How are people bringing you up when you're not in the room? And this is a really interesting piece, which I don't think will surprise anybody, men or women on the call, but women are more likely to downplay their certainty, meaning they come off as more tentative, insecure on purpose, where men are more likely to minimize their doubts, right? That idea of machismo or braggadocio, these are things that are kind of built into the more patriarchal societies. This is not coming from a place of judgment, just from a place of sharing the research. I see a lot of nods from folks on video, so there's some resonance there. Now, where we can really learn how to navigate some of these things is in this idea of the warmth competence line. Now, there's a great article in the Harvard Business Review about women on boards that I'm going to speak to now. And this is also true for men or other identities. So the idea of the warmth competence line states that there are kind of these two axes that we need to navigate in order to be seen as leaders. One is competence, and those are the ways that we show up that command respect. And the other is warmth, the ways that we create likability with others. Now, depending on how you balance competence and respectability and warmth and liking, changes the way that you are perceived as a leader. If you have low competence or you're perceived to have low competence and low warmth, people don't really like you. They have contempt for you. If you are well respected, very competent, but not very warm, you fall into this fear envy area, right? So people will do what you say because they're afraid of you. If you are very liked, everybody likes you, you're super popular, but people don't think you're all that competent, oftentimes the association with you might be pity. Oh, they're so nice. We have to invite them, or we have to bring them into the room because, they're just so nice, even if they don't add a lot of value. Where you really want to be is in this top corner, high warmth, high competence. This is admiration. This is where you can activate people to follow your lead. And women kind of have to strike a really tough balance and self-monitor to avoid seeming cold and to avoid seeming incompetent. And getting a seat at the table isn't really enough to help them exert influence. They also have to navigate this fine line. And so while oftentimes men get the benefit sometimes of being able to fall into these three, fear, envy, admiration, and pity, and still be seen as leaders, women have to work really, really hard to demonstrate both warmth and competence in order to avoid backlash. Now, some of the ways that this shows up, oh no, did I lose a slide? Oh no, we did. Sorry about that. I got scared. So before I go into the ways that it shows up, there are some simple ways, simple, immediate, applicable things that you can already start to incorporate to project warmth and competence. I've written a little bit of them here. Warmth, smiling, sounds super simple. Humans are really good lie detectors, though, more often than not. And so you want to make sure that when you're smiling, it is authentic, right? People can tell with the creases in your eyes and the way that the smile lines show up, whether or not you're faking a smile. Like this, totally fake. This is real, because I'm really excited to be here with you all. Other ways that you can project warmth are validating other people's feelings, right? Letting them know that they're heard and seen. That builds that rapport and relationship. And also this idea of using a confiding tone, kind of like let me let you in on a little secret. Not in terms of excluding others, but rather I'm going to level with you here. And three ways that you can project more strength and competence often are in the way that we project ourselves. So posture is really important here, standing up straight. And again, I want to call out here that these are perceptions, right? You can be totally competent and so kind and warm, but if others aren't perceiving you that way, it's going to be harder to exert influence on them. So competence and strengths, standing up straight, strong posture, feeling in command of yourself, of your energy, really that feeling of control within you. And that also extends to the idea of poise, right? That cool, calm, collected vibe. When we start getting flustered, which is totally natural, happens to the best of us, we lose some of that credibility that we might have been building up. And so being able to collect yourself, take a deep breath, and reestablish that control can help project strength. Now, I think about influence in kind of two different buckets. One is selling, kind of like the goals that I shared earlier. How do you sell your ideas to others? And the other is molding. How do you influence the way that other people are sharing their ideas, maybe direct them or shift the way that they're thinking about things? And I'll show it in a second. They're kind of overlapping Venn diagrams in my mind. I tend to be a visual thinker, but they're not mutually exclusive. So most of the things that you can do to sell your ideas are also things that you can use to mold other people's ideas and vice versa. And sometimes it helps to figure out where they play more strongly. But these methods include, like we talked about, strong body language, connecting with people personally, asking clarifying questions. We're going to get into that. Checking your understanding, making sure that you're on the same page, building consensus among the people who might be involved or in a particular meeting, asserting yourself, right? Sharing your thoughts, ideas, opinions with confidence, and playing up your expertise, right? Letting people know that you actually know what you're talking about and giving them examples, sometimes even in the moment. So how do some of these methods show up on that warmth competence line that we talked about? So in terms of competence, I've separated out the axes here, but that's just for my own visualization, right? Someone who might be perceived as incompetent might have really shy body language, slumped shoulders, they might not make eye contact, maybe their voice is uncertain, a little weak, quiet, and maybe their questions seem vague or pointless. Again, perception, right? Not fact about you. Someone who is competent is talking about their credentials. I'm trained, I'm certified, I was a manager for 20 years. They have strong body language, they make eye contact, they are standing upright, and they're regularly checking in to make sure that they're understanding you correctly. Did I get that right? Those kinds of questions. And somehow we perceive those people as more competent. And on the warmth line, someone who seems cold might cross their arms and turn away from you. Their vibe feels aloof or unapproachable. Maybe their questions are really pointed and come across as harsh, and maybe their comments even seem passive aggressive. People who we perceive as warm are connecting personally. They're asking questions about you, getting to know you. They're building consensus and collaborating as a group. Their body language is open and inviting. And their clarifications tend to be more gentle. Hey, I just wanted to check in. Did I hear that correctly? Sounds very different from, what the heck are you talking about? I don't understand this question, right? And my guess is we've heard both ends of the spectrum at some point in our careers. I think you have a sense of what kind of person you prefer to work with and follow in the workplace. So here's that Venn diagram that I mentioned. This is how I visualize the different methods. But again, they operate in conjunction. So you can use all of them in selling your own ideas and in molding. And I think some of them are more effective in either of the two directions. So building consensus, let's say you have an idea for a new project or a new product that you want your organization to launch. It might be helpful in advance to go to each of the stakeholders whose buy-in you need and check in with them, share your idea, get their feedback, and build that consensus before you get into that meeting where you're pitching it to everybody and they're hearing it for the first time. Similarly, if you're molding someone else's ideas, asking those clarifying questions, checking your understanding can be helpful because it causes them to sometimes rethink what they are bringing to the table and helps to direct the conversation in a constructive way. And of course, both selling your ideas and molding others' ideas are going to be aided by body language, having those personal connections, asserting yourself, and expressing and playing up your expertise. I'm just going to go through the chat to see if any good questions came in, or I'll ask Susanna and Leslie, anything come in that we want to talk about?
There we go. Yes, actually, there's an interesting point that was made about asking pointed questions. Let's see what she said. Jen wrote, sometimes pointed questions can be important for understanding, particularly with folks who have certain neurodiversities.
Great point. Yes. So I will call out the difference between specific and the way that I often think about pointed, and this is also a question of how we define each of the adjectives, is sometimes very harsh, right? And oftentimes when we receive pointed questions, it can feel like it is putting us on the defensive. And so can we be specific in how we're communicating, in the words that we're choosing, and asking specific questions, and without going into that space of harsh defense mode or creating defensiveness, if that helps to clarify where I'm coming with that. I hear somebody.
I'm hearing background noise of someone talking. Maybe everyone could mute themselves, or Susanna, you can mute everybody.
Yep, I think I just did.
All right. Here's another interesting point about perceptions of incompetence. Some people may make statements that sound like questions due to the lift of their voice at the end of the sentence. So yeah, these things can be subtle. Oh wait, Susanna, you muted Arielle too.
Oh, there I am. Okay. Thank you for letting me know, guys. So yes, tone is also so important because the way that we speak, there are so many biases that come in, and I can talk about that for a long time. I won't go into it too much, but yes, being mindful of the environment that we're in and the biases that might exist for other people and how they're perceiving us can be helpful. So one of the things that we want to make sure, it's a kind of a two-sided equation, right? One is, how do we self-monitor to make sure that we're showing up in a way that will be perceived as competent and warm based on the environment that we're in? And also, how do we foster environments that allow for diversity in the way that we show up and communicate, so that everyone has an opportunity to show up authentically and still be perceived as warm and competent in their own ways? So there's an inclusivity question in there. There's also a question of how can we adapt ourselves, and depending on, your I'll call it like neurotypicalness, that may or may not be easier. And still, it's a chicken or the egg, right? How do we make sure that we're doing both simultaneously, working on ourselves and encouraging environments that can foster that kind of openness and diversity? Great question. So let's talk about selling. I love this because I'm often in situations where I need to be selling, and it wasn't always something that I was comfortable with. And I think we all at some point either used to struggle with or struggle with this now. And some of my favorite things for putting selling into practice include that open body language, right? It's really hard to sell an idea when you're sitting back like this and avoiding eye contact, and maybe your tone is kind of low, maybe it's a little grumpy. It's kind of hard to buy into someone who's not excited about what they're selling to you. So we want to show up enthusiastic and open in our body language. Whenever possible, we want to make eye contact. That is definitely difficult in a Zoom environment. So we do our best, or we kind of hedge it and say, oh, I'm checking out the chat, or I'm looking at my notes, or whatever it is, to make sure that people know that we're still present with them. Using I statements is also really powerful, because one of the things that you might have realized in your experiences is that when people make sweeping generalizations, there's always going to be somebody who is the exception to that generalization. And oftentimes they're in the room. And we don't like it when people make assumptions about us on our behalf, generally. And that was a sweeping assumption. So using I statements can help bring some of those assumptions to light without putting it on or projecting it onto the group that you're in. So I feel strongly that if we pursue this direction for the project, it's going to have a really great impact. And here's some of the reasons why. I feel strongly that if we don't do this, that we're going to end up in a stronger position than we were before. Whatever you're bringing to the table, using those I statements, helps you kind of put your stick in the mud and see that you're passionate and strong in the opinion that you're sharing, but it also helps to prevent that defensiveness that might come up from other people. Asserting your experience is also sometimes really helpful here when you're trying to sell an idea. This can come up in a lot of different ways, right? It can be about sharing your training or certification. It can also be about sharing your experience, right? I've obviously never been a coach for the Knicks, but you could say, as a former coach for the Knicks, I'm really confident that this idea will build team support, right? Like, I've been through this before, so I know what I'm talking about. That's the vibe that you want to go for. This can also look like referencing something that adds credibility to what you're sharing. You might have noticed that when I started talking about the warmth competence line, I mentioned that it was from an article in the Harvard Business Review. I didn't come up with that, but having that grounded in a reputable source and in a resource that I can then share with people, I'm offering that this is something that has weight to it. And I'm not pulling it out of thin air. Building consensus, I mentioned a little bit about this earlier, is also going to be really helpful when you're selling something new, especially if it's brand new. So can you collect intel before you go into that sales mode? Do other people on your team or in your company face similar challenges as you? Do they think about things the same way that you do? Do they have feedback for you about what you're trying to come up with or input? I have a client that is trying to gain input for a new system for their company. It's going to overhaul the way that they do their project management. And it's not a huge company, about 30 people on the team, but any kind of big sweeping change is going to be a big sweeping change. And so one of the things that they've been focusing on in building consensus is going to some of the team leaders and making sure that they're unhappy with the way that they're currently experiencing their project management. Do they like the tool? What don't they like? What would they like better? I've been researching this tool. Take a look. What do you think? Engaging that reaction, asking questions allows for more input for you. Maybe you'll learn something new that informs the way that you want to sell your idea, but it also helps those people that you're talking to feel heard, listened to, valued, so that when you bring the pitch to the bigger group, you really get everybody on board pretty quickly. And any I can't think of the word, but someone who's not on board, those other people might come to the defense of the idea without you even needing to say anything, which is also helps to build credibility among the team. Now we have the other side of things, molding other people's ideas. And first and foremost here, I will say lots of questions. Questions are one of the best ways to get other people to think about things differently. The important thing here is to think about your tone, right? We want to show up in a way that is curious and non-judgmental. And this helps people feel safe to open up. So let's say someone has pitched their ideas, you can raise a hand and say, hey, you mentioned this. How might that goal compete with this other goal that our company has? What challenges maybe haven't we accounted for? Very different than this is totally in competition with our other goal. What were you thinking? Right? Very different tone, very different reaction from the person that you're going to get. Another type of question might be when you talked about this project's goals, what kinds of conflicts did you consider for the timelines? Right? Open-ended, even if it's a closed-ended, meaning a yes or no question, you can still ask it in an open-ended tone, which helps the other person feel like they're allowed to speak and they're not being belittled. Checking your understanding. This is another way of asking questions, right? We talked a bit about this earlier. So when you say that this is a challenge or resourcing is a challenge, what do you mean? Do you mean people on the ground, resources in terms of people? Is it budget, or is there something else that we haven't talked about? So making sure that the way that they're defining terms is the same way that you're defining terms and that you understand correctly. And the last piece here is, again, asserting yourself and integrating your expertise whenever it's relevant, right? Maybe you've been through a similar process in the past and you can bring that experience into the room. You know, when I did this overhaul with my team, it backfired. Maybe we want to have some other alternatives considered. Or what other alternatives have you considered? A lot of this is about reflecting back what someone has brought into the room and asking questions to help shape and shift the direction of the conversation so that ultimately everybody is on board with some outcome. Even if it's the original idea that someone brought in, at least now everyone is on the same page and you have helped to influence that direction. Now, I want to show a short video. It's about 3 or 4 minutes long. And then I'm going to ask a few questions. I'm debating whether or not I want to show it. No, I want to show it. Okay, let's do it. I'm going to make sure that I'm sharing my sound. Enjoy. Let's see what you guys think. Let me know if you can't hear.
Paul is the Human Resources Manager at Quartz Power Group. He has called a meeting with some of his colleagues to discuss a new training program.
Right, shall we get started? Well, we're here to talk about a new training program for the call centre. David, I asked you to come because you were involved in the market research we did, so I thought you could give us a short summary of the findings. And Anna, obviously, it's your customer service teams who will be affected by this.
Yes, exactly.
So we thought you might have some ideas on the best way to approach the training program. And Maria will be developing and running the training. Okay, David, could you run us through the main points from the research?
Sure. We worked with a market research agency over a period of a few weeks to gather information about our customers and what they thought of us. And the results were, well, mixed.
Sorry, can I just check? Why was this research done? Had there been complaints or?
Some complaints, yes, but also we are losing customers in the region and we wanted to know why.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand. Was the research about getting customer points of view or about customer profiles?
It was to get customer feedback on the company and its services.
Right, I see.
So the results showed a few areas where customers were not happy. One of the most common, how shall I put it, issues was with the call center.
I see. Can you be more specific?
Well, basically, it seems that customers feel they are not getting good service and they are leaving us for another supplier.
Right. So are you saying customers are leaving us because of the service from the staff, or could there be other reasons too? I mean, could it be that we haven't got very good systems in place for our staff?
Yeah, could be. Anna?
Look, I have no problem with giving the staff a refresher course, but starting completely from scratch seems like a waste of time and money. They all receive training when they start anyway.
Yes, that's a good point, Anna. And we don't know yet if we will have to start from scratch. It may be that we haven't done enough to monitor their activity, and that a simple refresher course will be enough. Or it may be that we have to look at customer contact from start to finish and try to implement some new protocols. Maria?
Yes, that's right. I'm sure there's a way of dealing with this sensitively. Anna, I realize it's not easy for you to suggest more training for your staff. So I wondered if we could start with a review of the current training approach and look at what we need to do to address the problems brought up in the survey.
Yes, we could do that.
But I would need to look at the full report first, of course. Anna, I understand your point about possibly wasting time and money, so perhaps you and I could look at the report together?
Yes, okay.
Then...
Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to pause there. I think most of you got a good gist because I saw a lot of great comments in the chat. So given we watched about a minute and a half or so, 2 minutes, there was a lot that happened. What did you think of the conversation? Drop in the chat. Some people already dropped in what they were noticing, which is great. Some people called out some selling techniques and some molding techniques, but what did you think? How did the conversation go so far? People fixing blame rather than fixing problems. Yes. We see that so often in meetings, right? When something is going wrong, it's a question of like, who's at fault? Tense. Yeah, it was a little awkward in some moments. Content was pretty good, but the real connection was missing. Fair enough. Body language felt stilted. People were offended. Yeah. Not making assumptions about what the answer to the challenges should be seemed to move meeting in a productive direction. Yeah. So there was the acknowledgement that like being open and asking these open-ended questions to explore what was really going on helped figure out where we should be going. The man was an ally to the woman and gave her credibility, gave her a stage to work on. Yeah, amazing. A few people noticed that the main woman said sorry a few times. Yes, that qualifier can be linked to not looking as competent sometimes, especially for women. They tend to apologize for interjecting more than men tend to. And sometimes we can use it strategically, right? To interject at different points. Not necessarily the best word to use to interject, or to bring up different questions, and also just give some grace to the folks that use that as kind of an interlude. Yeah, that some people looked uncomfortable and maybe even blindsided in that conversation. Yeah, great. So there are some comments that are coming up about the nature of the video. Totally reasonable. Full disclosure, that is a video to help people learn business English. So if it felt stilted, it's probably because it was. But I love it because I think it does a really good job of mimicking some of the things that come up in meetings regularly, right? Some meetings feel very stilted and procedural and formal, and some meetings feel awkward. And some people do end up feeling blindsided in meetings. And how do we, as individuals, show up to these meetings where maybe it's a little bit uncomfortable and shift the conversation into a more productive direction? Because we can have that kind of influence, right? That's what all of this is about, is creating a pathway to influencing others and influencing the way that people perceive us. Great. I love the commentary still coming through. Feel free to start dropping in the chat too. What would you have done differently in this scenario to be more effective? There's also a great conversation happening in the chat. I'll call out about the sorry and the cultural implications of it. Is it more British? You know, what do we do in the US? How is the word sorry perceived? I think this is great. I'm going to revisit this later. But if you want, drop in the chat what you would do differently. I think it's really helpful to also learn from other people's experiences what we do and don't necessarily want to do. So I'm going to start wrapping up here so that we can answer any other questions that came through. We defined leadership and influence. We discussed some of the challenges and opportunities, especially for women and people who aren't necessarily as represented in the workplace. We've explored techniques for selling our own ideas and molding others. And we started identifying some tactical ways to practice showing up competently, warmly, and confidently. I see a lot coming through about the setting little things that we can do to help facilitate meetings more effectively, setting an agenda, letting people speak, waiting until they finish without interruption. Yeah, there's a note about agenda chaos in the video. Sharing reports, right? When we're all talking about one subject, it's really helpful if everybody has read through it. There are companies that encourage this. Companies like Amazon are well known for having docs, right? You write a document before you go into a meeting, and everybody spends the first portion of the meeting, a few minutes, reading through the document before they say anything. Not a commentary again on Amazon, just in terms of the way that they run their meetings. It can be helpful to get all of us on the same page. So, given all the things that we've covered today, what do you want to try to put into practice? I'm going to make a sweeping generalization that most of you will have at least one meeting coming up in the next 24 hours to a week. What do you want to try out? Feel free to drop that in the chat. Maybe we can inspire each other to do something new. Try not to interrupt others. Great. Yeah, sometimes it can be hard to not interrupt, especially when we're excited, right? I love that, right? We have so much enthusiasm. We just want to get in there. But it's more impactful to let somebody finish and then pile on your enthusiasm afterwards. Focusing on listening. Great. Asking more questions, especially when you're in a hurry, you know, and you're in the get it done mode. I think that's great. Focus on some of the molding suggestions. Yeah, asking more questions, being gentle but assertive, noticing your body language when you're speaking to others, These are amazing. I love that. Yeah, one of the things that I learned in my first day of training as a coach, it's been a few years now, was the importance of asking questions. And it was a huge paradigm shift for me to go from being the person who gives advice and interrupts and just wants to be, make the impact right away, to being the person who sits back and asks the question. And it turns out that's really effective. Great. Okay. For not interrupting, this is a great suggestion if anybody wants to incorporate it. I found it helpful to have a partner or buddy in the room who can observe and give feedback to me later. Or if they're sitting next to you, or if it's, you have a private chat going offline, they can give feedback in the moment and hint to you when you're not sitting back and listening. I've also, for people who tend to use a lot of filler words, I've also had people find a buddy in the meeting to take note of how often they use filler words, so that they can learn to build that awareness and slow down, so they don't use the ums and the likes as much. This is wonderful. I love this. Someone noted, yes, this is a great tip. If you want to save any of these suggestions and observations for yourself, you can hit those 3 notes in the corner of the chat and save the chat for yourself and come back and review this later. So with that, if there are any open questions, now would be a great time to bring them forward. I'm also going to drop my email and LinkedIn in the chat in case you want to ask anything offline. And if you want to ask a question, but you don't want to put it in the general chat, you can also feel free to send it directly to me or Leslie or Susanna, and we can read it out anonymously. And I will stop sharing now so that I can see all of your faces. Leslie or Susanna, any questions that came through that I missed along the way that we should focus on answering first?
I think you kept up with a lot of things. There was also sort of interesting discussion and commentary, some of which you noticed about specific words like sorry that can have very different meanings in different parts of a country and different cultures, and which, as one person noted, when you're working internationally, even a word or a phrase can really create misunderstanding or misperception when the other side is reading it differently than you intended.
Yes, great question. There's a question that just came in about body language and the incorporation of gestures. That's a great question because I also talk with my hands. What I would say is being aware of how you are gesturing can be really helpful. And when in doubt, my number one piece of advice is to slow down. Oftentimes what happens is we get so excited and we start talking really quickly and our hands kind of follow and it feels a little like all over the place. When we are able to slow down and have a little bit more control over our speed, our cadence, our tone, and also our body, we demonstrate more poise. So if you find that your gestures are getting to be a bit much, that awareness is really, really great. The more you can cultivate that to be in the moment and not in hindsight is even better. And recognizing it and slowing down. That's my biggest piece of advice, but it's definitely a really personal thing. Some people are, very gesticulatingly prone and others are not. There's nothing inherently wrong either way. I think the question is more, how can you make sure that you're in control of it rather than it being in control of you?
We're getting some people saying they have to jump off to another meeting, which of course we understand.
Of course. Well, thank you all for joining. If anybody does want to stick around for any final questions, I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer.
We've had a couple of people commenting on And I've certainly noticed this too in different settings. Sort of that line between how do you call out your expertise, kind of signify your competence based on qualifications or other experiences you've had without coming across as arrogant.
Yeah, it's a fine line, right? And I think a lot of it, I will say, does come down to first intention and second tone. So if the tone is, oh, in my day, back in Harvard, in this little college outside of Boston, we did it this way, sounds pretty highfalutin, and we don't tend to respond well to that. And usually the intention there is to make one seem bigger or more impressive than the others. So when our tone is more factual and our intention is to add value and just add another point of reference into the conversation, then those kinds of comments can be helpful. So I think I saw a comment in there about people also not naming names as a way that sounds, a thing that sounds arrogant, right? Oh, I went to a small school outside of Boston, when really they mean Harvard, right? They are almost never referring to Tufts. So, you know, being mindful that it's okay to have had, you know, experiences at amazing institutions or companies, or have had positions of power. That's okay. There's nothing that you don't need to hide that. Hiding it implies that other people shouldn't be in the know or should feel bad about not being in the know. And then sharing it too much then is like, why are you leaning on that? As if you don't have any other leg to stand on. So it is a fine line, also very culturally influenced, right? How much does our organization want us to promote ourselves? How much have we learned or been socialized to keep certain things private or hidden or downplay our experience? There's a great book by Meredith Feynman that I recommend to pretty much all of my clients. It's called Brag Better. It's specifically targeted to women, but I've recommended it to men before to great results. And it's all about how you can learn to share your experience in a really factual way without coming across as arrogant or braggadocious or highfalutin. I don't know why that word came to me today, but it did. So I'm going to keep using it. And I would say she is really an expert on navigating those lines between arrogance and confidence. Highly recommended.
Thank you for that resource. I really look forward to checking out that book. As you can imagine, as career coaches, this is something Nicole and I work with our client, and Susanna with the students work with our clients a lot on. And one thing I thought of while you were speaking, and tell me if this fits in, is that maybe it's a little different if, like, you're being introduced at a podium like today, where we want to say where you studied and what your certifications are, versus if you're sitting around a table with coworkers and peers. Does that make sense about sort of how
Yeah, for
you're presenting
sure.
things and what you're referencing would be different?
That's a great point. So yes, when other people can bring forth our experience for us, that helps, right? It takes away the pressure on us to navigate, right, between being the arrogant, bragger and the humble bragger, I'll say. And at the same time, right, a lot of these experiences are just things that you've been through. So, and they might be relevant. I can share from my own experience when I'm working with corporate executives or budget owners, and we're working on figuring out how to bring my services into a company. I oftentimes have to share my credentials, right, really purposefully, in order to make sure that they are aware of what I'm bringing to the table, right? I'm certified, I'm credentialed. That means that other people have had to verify my capabilities and my competency. And so there isn't a lot of doubt about what they're getting. And we can bring that into our experiences generally, right? Whether that's an experience that we had on a particular project or a school that we went to or an article that we read, whatever it is, we can share that really matter-of-factly so that other people know what they're getting. And yes, if someone else can share that you went to a small school outside of Boston and that you did your PhD and, you know, wrote 17 different dissertations, like, great, let them do that for you. But I also am of the belief that if you've gone through those experiences, then you have earned the right to share them with others and bring your expertise into the place that you are inhabiting, whether that's work or home or social life. You did it. Like, you wrote those dissertations, you should be able to talk about it without feeling ashamed of the privilege or the associations with whatever that experience was. Mindfully and strategically, I'll say that, big asterisks. You want to make sure that you're just doing it with the right intentions. I also want to share another resource who I think is great. He has a YouTube video channel and a Instagram, if you're on Instagram, or TikTok, if you're on TikTok. His name is Vin Jiang. I just shared a link to his YouTube. He goes by the handle Ask Vin, and he does a lot. He offers a lot of videos about how to communicate effectively, how to improve your public speaking skills. And I find that a lot of his tools and tips are really helpful in rethinking how we show up. Some of them are practical exercises that you can use for yourself to do some reflection work, including but not limited to recording yourself in a video and then rewatching it and listening to it, which is excruciating but helpful. But he also gives some practical tips that you can apply, and I think he's a really helpful resource.
Personally, I really, really appreciate that, because sometimes I'll have particularly a young client, a young alum telling me, oh, well, I get a lot of great career information from TikTok. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, I believe that exists, but I also believe it's kind of like the Wild West. And there's a lot of people out there giving advice and having a channel who, you know, are not what I would necessarily recommend. So I love getting a recommendation from a vetted source like yourself. I guess one thought that, if you don't mind, one thought that I had listening to you is think, what if a lot of the people that I talk to in my work are, say, just a couple of years, 1 or 2 years out of graduating from college, so they're very young, so they can't cite I've had that experience and this worked for me, or I led that team, but they have an idea, or they have a thought or a perspective, and they're having trouble getting it heard. I mean, sometimes they just need to go to a new job or, you know, move into some other role. But do you have advice if they're not necessarily moving, other than moving to a new job or another role?
Oh boy, I've been there. I totally relate to that. I think part of the challenge when we're young is we don't always have the vocabulary, definitely maybe not the credibility, but we don't have the vocabulary to speak about the ideas that we want to bring to the table, whether that's an observation or feedback or, you know, something that we're excited to integrate or launch at this company, or really anywhere, right? Again, it doesn't matter if it's at work or at home. And so my advice is to first and foremost slow down and think about what you want to convey, right? What is the messaging that you want to bring? Are you trying to launch an idea? If so, can you work on building consensus, right? Get that input, get that feedback, try and understand people's challenges. Even if you don't bring years of experience and expertise, what you can bring is validation from the group that you're in. And then also do the research, right? Don't be afraid to look into things on your own before you bring it to the group. Can you find articles? Can you talk to people? Can you get feedback from outside sources, assuming that there isn't a confidentiality issue, in order to bring more credible vocabulary and terminology into the conversation. I know in my first job out of college, right about when I met you, Leslie, I had a lot of observations and feedback about some of the cultural issues that were going on. The company, the division that I was working for was recently acquired. So it was an outside company that was brought in. There were cultural issues at play, and I was really unsatisfied. And I noticed a lot of these things and I brought them to HR, and I didn't have the words. So it sounded like I was just complaining. But what I wanted to convey was that I was interested in figuring out solutions, but I didn't know how to say that. And so I think the more we can slow down ourselves to understand the environment that we're in, understand what our intentions are and what we want to get out of the experience and out of the selling of the idea, the more we can gather the resources and implement some of these methods to bring them in a stronger, more confident, and more likely to succeed kind of way.
Thank you. And sometimes what I tell people is when they're able to do the slowing down, the thinking, all of those steps that you mentioned, and they're still not getting the response that they hope for or buy-in or whatever, sometimes they do need to change the job, change the situation. You can't persuade everybody, but there is that thoughtful way of at least learning from the process of trying.
Yes. I mean, some environments are not conducive to, bringing new ideas in, and we want to be mindful of that. What kind of environments are we choosing to be a part of, and how do we foster more inclusive, open, collaborative spaces? And sometimes it's a matter of getting, the right person on board. And so how can we be strategic in building those relationships with people who can amplify and kind of buy into our project or our idea or our observations, to sponsor us, and, be the first follower almost, right? If you're in a meeting and you're leading the charge, you need one person to second the nomination before you can proceed. And getting that person on board can be really helpful in opening the conversation at the very least, if not getting the support to move forward with whatever the idea is. And that goes into building consensus and rapport and relationships as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions that have come up?
Well, there was a couple of questions about how to do these things work differently, or any tips on when you're in a nonprofit setting, particularly when the people you're working with and needing to motivate or influence are volunteers. Are there some differences or thoughts you could offer on that?
That's a great question. I have not worked in nonprofit, and I don't do a lot of work with folks. Well, that's a lie, actually. I do a lot of work with folks in nonprofit, but the challenge with volunteers, I think, is the same that we might find in organizations that have employee resource groups, where people volunteer to participate in non-work activities at the office. And part of the question is, why are they doing it? Why are they involved? And when we can tap into what's actually motivating them, it's typically not money. It's typically not, validation. They can get that elsewhere. Usually it's something related to being attracted to the mission, feeling like they're part of a community, feeling valued and heard. So how can we make sure that the impact that they want to create is the impact that they feel that they are creating? And if that means that there are more opportunities to listen to volunteers' input and adapt their input and feedback and ideas to do things differently or improve things, great. That's a great resource from people who actually care. They're choosing to be there, not just because someone is paying them, but because they believe in the mission and the purpose of that organization. And so tapping into why they're there, what's motivating, and how you can amplify that motivation is going to be a great way to help them feel involved and to encourage them to spearhead things. I'm involved in an organization that it's a community organization for organizational development nerds like I am. And we have to get volunteers from the community to lead events and spark conversation and host things. And usually they do it because they feel connected to the community, or there's a topic that they're interested in exploring and they want to do that with other people who are like-minded. That's great. Like, take the stage, take the microphone. We want that, because whether you're in a nonprofit or a for-profit or an organization or an after-school activity or whatever it is, you can't do everything all by yourself. So you want to make sure that the people who are choosing to spend the time with you, who are choosing to be part of the mission or the vision, whatever it is, are activated and empowered to put things into practice. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's kind of how I think about it.
Thanks. Anything else you've noticed, Susanna, that we should bring forward before we close? She's muted.
I'm good at muting myself and others. You know what? So many wonderful comments in the chat. Just wanted to say thanks again to everyone. A reminder, you can save the chat for all the important links in the conversation. Richard, really appreciate your point about respect being key, individuals, respect for self, etc. I don't think so. I think we've really covered most things as far as I can tell.
Amazing. I'm so glad. This was such a great conversation. Thank you for all your questions and observations and engagement in the chat. I really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, I just want to comment. This is one of the most engaged chat discussions I've ever seen. People responding to each other. And I was only seeing the ones that were either directed to me or to everyone. So I'm sure there were other things happening as well, but it was a great discussion in the chat as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for having me. Is there anything else from your end, Leslie or Susanna, that you want to share before we close out?
No, not that I can think of.
Amazing. Cool. Thank you again for having me. Thank you for being here with me today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
And I will say thank you, Arielle, for your inspiring and encouraging presentation. Thanks to everyone again for your engagement, your listening, if you were quietly listening or you're discussing on the chat. 2 last items real quick. Please complete the survey that you'll see pop up in your browser by magic when you leave the Zoom call, the meeting today. Again, we really appreciate feedback, thoughts, impressions, whatever you're able to share. And also register for April and May webinars if those are of interest. Job Search Success Secrets, say it 3 times fast, and Ace the Interview, which, by the way, today's presentation fits so perfectly into acing an interview, where you have to both engage and sell and mold, but you also have to listen and walk and chew gum all at the same time. So that's where the practice and preparation comes in. Thank you for being with us and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.